you all. First of all, thank you for being here, and I'm totally honored to be up here. As Mark said, I used to work for Evergreen Hospice, and quite honestly, it's one of my most favorite jobs ever. I want to tell you a little bit about how I've come to believe that death is not failure, and how I think we can learn to live, how we can learn to die well. I first was exposed to death when my little brother Jeff, he was 10 years old. He was diagnosed with neurofibromatosis, and he had a small tumor on his pituitary gland, and the doctor was quite forthcoming and told him and my mom and dad, that if this little tumor were to grow, he would die. And I just remember my little brother coming to my room that night and asking me, "What do you think heaven's like?" And being the only social worker sorry, a little clock here. Oh. Being the only person that went to church in my family, I was pretty confident I knew exactly what to tell him. So I let him know that heaven was like Disneyland, and he'd be able to do everything and anything he wanted to. And then I prayed that night that he would never find out if I was right. And he didn't, at least not at that time. And then when I was a senior in high school, I was a housekeeper, and I had a gal that I worked with. Her name was Barb, and she was 58 years old, and she developed terminal breast cancer. And she needed a helper at nighttime, so I volunteered to stay the nights with her. And she would ring this little bell for me, and I'd go down and help her to the bathroom and clean her up. And being very curious as I would ask her, "What's it like to know you're dying?" And she told me, and we talked about what she wanted done with her things, and we just had very open conversations about what it must be like in the afterlife. And so when Barb passed, I felt a peace about her going, because she had a peace about going. And then about a year later, one of my very close friends, her name was Tony, she was like a mentor to me, and I also cleaned her house. And she was 41 years old when she developed metastatic breast cancer. And unlike Barb, Tony was going to fight her cancer. She was going to beat it. And so we never talked about dying. And we did every treatment you can imagine, including giving her coffee enemas every morning. And for 2 years, we tried traditional and non-traditional types of treatments. And I'm so excited to say that she went into remission. And we were so happy that she won that battle. And then 3 months later, she died. And I was devastated, because definitely I felt like death was a failure. The doctors failed, the treatments failed, everybody, God failed. And for me, I didn't know how to grieve that, because Tony would not talk about the possibility of dying, because to her, that was giving up hope. And as a result, everything that happened in her death was so different than the one before. And we had a very hard time grieving it. The following spring, I graduated from the University of Washington School of Social Work, and I was fortunate enough to land a job working with severely head-injured and comatose patients at a rehab facility. And once again, I was faced with the idea that society as a whole does not feel like we can talk about death and dying. And while these patients laid in those beds, they weren't, in my mind, really living, but you would never suggest that to a family. To talk about that would mean to give up hope. So in my mind, they were sort of prolonging death, not prolonging life. But if I would have ever brought that up, I would have been dismissed from the case for sure. And then after 2 years or so of working there, I left that and went and stayed home to have children. And my first of my 3 grandparents died when I was 28 years old. And it was a grandfather who was airlifted from Whidbey Island, and he had had a stroke. He was on a ventilator. Never had we talked about what he would want or not want. So the family and I had to make the decision to take him off the ventilator, and he passed away. And then the following year, my grandmother, my favorite grandmother, had COPD, and she had a critical event that landed her in the hospital on a ventilator. And when she finally came off, she made the decision she didn't want to go back on, but she wasn't ready to die. And she had things she needed to do. And so once again, we had this situation where I couldn't find peace. And I was driving there, and she died. And I felt so guilty. I felt like I missed her death, and I felt cheated. And I had similar feelings as I did with Tony, that death again was a failure at that time. I couldn't wrap my brain around it. And then the following year, my last grandmother got diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer. And in her case, she decided that she wanted to go on hospice. And so that was my very first experience with hospice. And I was her designated caretaker. And the whole family was around in her house, and we would laugh. And I remember one time somebody was whispering in her room, and she looked at him and she said, "I'm not dead yet." And she was ready, she wanted to be a part of that. And when she died in my arms, I again felt this peace. And that was what I wanted to pass to other people, is this, there was this up and down situation that I felt we needed to do something different. And so when my daughters were 6 and 7 years old, I decided to go back to the University of Washington and get my master's degree. And I was fortunate enough to land a position at Evergreen Hospice. And I became, that's where I did my internship. And I just fit right in, I fell in love. And I had a chance to work at the Cancer Center, Evergreen Hospice, the actual center, and in the homes, and in the hospital. And I just found the things we were doing was amazing to help people, what I would call die well. So after graduation, I continued to work at the hospice and then moved into the critical care unit. And I just had this weird passion. I always tell people my favorite thing to do is help people die, which they think is kind of weird, but I've probably seen about 100 people pass, and I just find it really amazing. It's one of my great passions. I never really knew how passionate that would feel until my brother got diagnosed with cancer. Helping him was one of the toughest and greatest things all at once. That was 18 years ago that my little brother Jeff was diagnosed with a rare tumor called adrenal cancer. It's like a 1 in a million tumor. And I got the call when I was actually working at Evergreen in the critical care unit. And they found this mass, and I jumped into action. You see, my little brother, he had anxiety and depression, and he was the kind of guy who was sort of like an Eeyore, and everything was sort of negative. He was very obsessive compulsive, so he would get to work every single day, 2 hours early, in case there was a car accident, on his 30-minute commute. On Saturdays at 10 o'clock, he was at the bank, and if he made a mistake in his bank book, he'd always have to get a new one. And right before his surgery, he wanted to make sure that we use a blue pen, not the black one on his bank book. So you can imagine this mass threw his world upside down, as it did mine. He was petrified that he was going to die and go to hell. He had this idea of heaven and hell, and being that he wasn't going to church, he was pretty convinced that that was a possibility. And I really convinced him it wasn't, because if he went, I had no hope. I was screwed, because he was a much better guy than I had been as a kid. So Jeff went into surgery on February 14th, the year 2000, and he was filled with angst and fear, and it took 3 surgeons 14 hours to remove the mass out of his abdomen area. He went straight up to the critical care unit where he was barely alive, and I stayed with him day and night, and then about 10 days afterwards, they decided to remove the ventilator. And he said, "Can you guys turn the lights on?" And we all looked at each other, because the lights were shining in his eyes. And it's then that we realized that he had suffered a stroke on his optic chiasm, which is a little tiny pinpoint spot in your head, and he could see nothing. He was completely blind. Again, a 1 in a million consequence to this surgery he had. But something else had happened at that moment. I prayed and begged God to take him, to let him die, because again, he was like an Eeyore. There's no way that this young man could handle this, and I felt like it was the most selfless thing I could do, is just let him go. And he didn't die. And in fact, when we came in his room, one of his favorite things to do is to go like this to me, as if I have some kind of crusty in my nose, and I'd run to the bathroom and he'd just be laughing. Because of course he couldn't see a thing. Or if the nurses would say, would you like me to turn the lights out? And he'd say, "That's dark in my head. If it makes you feel better, go ahead." It was like Eeyore had died and we had now Winnie the Pooh. And I couldn't have expected that. He was funny, and he embraced his blindness and his condition better than all of us could have. I stayed with Jeff day and night and decided to bring him home with us when it was time for discharge because of my medical background, and I was sort of like a second mom to him. And so I brought him home, and through some ups and downs, he ended up back in the hospital, and then the surgeon told us he had 6 weeks to live. So I immediately called Evergreen Hospice. They started care. The nurses were amazing, of course, as were the social workers and the aides and everybody. And they were so amazing that he didn't die. And you can't kick a blind, dying guy out because he's not dead. And he continued to live. So about 2 years later, still living with me, still needing a lot of care, because to be blind is just something I can't even explain hardly. He wanted to start a homeless project to give back to the community, and it was called Sack Lunch Sundays. And so with our family's help, he collected all kinds of donations, because not very many people would refuse giving a blind dying guy donations. And so we would go down and we gave out anywhere from 140 to 400 lunches every single month. And trust me, he was very obsessive about making sure we counted everything that went in those sack lunches, because of course you couldn't see it. So, well, then Jeff's cancer came back, and for the last 8 months of his life, I called Hospice, and they came back, and I see a happy face, one of my favorite little hospice social workers out there, in fact, and my first boss, I was going to say, shout out to Chris Clemens. Anyway, they were there, and they were the most amazing support and helped our family talk openly about things. And one of the things I really valued was the fact that I enjoy talking about these things, and so I was able to talk to my brother and help him through those as well. And many people would have looked at my brother and thought, man, it's terrible that he wasn't healed. And I saw that my brother was healed. He was a great example that death was not a failure for him. I love the fact that my brother had a chance to plan his own funeral, because one of the things that he wanted at his funeral was for people to laugh. And so he sort of demanded that we play a song called Another One Bites the Dust as his parting song. And so we did. It's just one of those great examples of what happens when you get to plan your own funeral. So, though Jeff died, I believed he was living more freely and with more intention. In the 4 years he was sick than the 30 before. He laughed more, he had more gratitude, more peace, and there was no cure for his type of cancer, and so there was no fighting, if you will. He accepted it, and through hospice and the care that he received, he was definitely healed. One of the things I learned in that was that to have faith in the unimaginable, because nobody could have imagined that this would happen for him. His dream was that his lessons of gratitude and being grateful for things, because again, he would look around and say, I have it all. I have a chef, I have a maid, I have a nice home, I have entertainment. He had it all, and for the 30 years before that, he never would have had that attitude. My book, Blind Awakening, chronicles our experience, and it takes Jeff journaled through a tape recorder, so I've ended up transcribing that whole experience and got to memorialize our journey. And in that, his parting sentence was always, I can see God more clearly in the darkness than I ever could the light. It was an amazing journey. So what I'd like to share with you with my brother's story, as well as so many other patients that I've worked with, is that I think when we talk about death and dying, we somehow feel like we're robbing sick people of hope. And I actually don't believe that. I think that hope by definition is a feeling of expectation or a desired outcome. And of course we hear someone sick, we hope for a cure. But sometimes that cure looks different. It doesn't look like just the disease being cured. It's their soul, it's their spirit, it's so much more than that. I believe that when we talk about death and dying, we remove fear and allow the sick person and others to have more honest and valuable discussions. I think sometimes people think that just because we talk about death, somehow it's going to happen. And it's like a will, just because you do one, it doesn't mean you're dying. And I have found that people feel relieved when they have talked about their possible death, especially when they can be part of planning the process, as Jeff did. I believe there's less guilt, more peace, and a deeper connection with the person for having shared those valuable discussions. I'm hoping that many of you can relate to that here, that when we have those kinds of discussions, it sort of takes out the questions about what that person might want, what their values are, what they hope their legacies are, for example. I know for me, I think it's important because a lot of times with sudden deaths, we don't get that chance. And so it's important that each and every one of you, for me as well, that we talk about this now with our family. My kids know where I want to be buried and where I want my ashes sprinkled, and they know to get rid of my stuff. It's just stuff, right? But people hold on to it as if somehow it's sacred because it belonged to that person. So they know it's okay, let it go. And we've been able to talk about what songs I want, how long I want my service, no more than 45 minutes. When we approach death as though it's part of living, we can remove the stigma and the fear that surrounds it. I also believe that when we change this idea about fighting, I know we use that a lot, especially in the world of cancer. Someone's fighting their illness. Well, when we fight, there's a winner and there's a loser. And it actually is promoting this whole stigma of death being a failure. And I know from my example with Tony, we failed, is how it felt. But the truth is, nobody fails because it's the one common denominator we all have the second we take our first breath, is we are all dying and we're not promised to live old. And a life cut short is not a life not lived. A life cut short is not a life not lived. And when we value each and every day, we change the view of living in that way. I've seen people who fight so hard is what they think, and they still die. And I've seen people who ought to and want to die, and they don't. And it's not because they're not fighting. We don't have the real control over it that we think. So I instead of saying the word fight, I like to propose that we use something like dealing with or managing. I had an ankle injury where I wasn't walking for the last 4.5 months up until a few weeks ago. And no one told me I was fighting an ankle injury. They said I was dealing with it or coping. And so I just encourage you to just change that little language. It can make a difference, and especially for the person who has like cancer, because if they are dying, they feel somehow like they have failed. And I think that it would change how they view themselves. We should receive the same level of respect, praise, and help, whether we're doing aggressive treatment. This is another area. We always ask, are they doing chemo? Or we put this pressure on people that anything less of that aggressive treatment is not treatment. And I'm excited that now there's a big movement. In fact, there's a bill in the Senate right now for palliative care and hospice education to start shifting this. And it's going to take some time in the society to make that happen. I also want to say, just because a person dies, it does not mean they failed or anyone else failed. Death is part of living, as I remind you. When we address the topic of death openly, we take some of the fear away, we give ourselves and our loved ones the opportunity to plan and prepare, and it allows us to be a part of that journey. Another thing I hear a lot is guilt, and as a therapist, this is the most common thing I hear is someone's dying and I feel guilty. I felt that. I felt guilty that I didn't make it to the hospital. And I hear people say, I felt guilty I didn't take that call. I feel guilty that I didn't go visit that person. And I think guilt is fantastic. It shows you have a conscience. But it doesn't mean that we have done something wrong. And so I like to suggest that we take a different word and say, I feel sad that I didn't see that person. I feel disappointed. Because guilt is not the real word, because we can't be everywhere all the time. And we can't pick that phone up all the time. And again, why? Because death is part of living, and it's going to happen whether we are there or whether we're not. And so I think we can shift that word from guilt to another more appropriate word like sadness. In closing, I want to leave you with some final thoughts. When you address your own fears, we are part of making that shift. So think to yourself, what would you want to leave your family with? If many of you might be grieving here or have gone through that, if you were the one that was passed, what would you tell yourself or this loved one? And how do you want to be remembered? What do you want your final message to be? And last of all, what would your legacy be? And when you think about that and you share that with your family, you're giving them an incredible gift. So I want to remind you, healing can take place even when the person's illness isn't cured. And we can still live a fulfilling, wonderful life even while we're dying. So I hope this helps to kind of reframe some of your own view about death as failure. Because again, I don't believe death is failure. I think it's part of living. So thank you.
See, I told you it was going to be good. I'm just thinking, oh my goodness. If I heard another one bites the dust at a funeral, how could you not smile?